Hey, welcome back to Wednesdays in the Word. We're in a series of dealing with grief and loss. This is not a downer series. This is really designed to provide for you some tools and helps for dealing with some of the sense of loss and grief that so many of us have suffered with through this last 18 months or so of pandemic and the crazy political cycle and all that goes into it. So again, for those of you that are, suffering with this, these are some practical helps, I think, that you'll be able to grab a hold of and use. And, most of this is based upon, I've got two books I've written. One's called Grief Relief, which is more of like a textbook on dealing with grief and loss. You can find that through booksbyvision.org. But also I've written a small booklet, and again, I've got a little picture of it here, called Mourning to Dancing. And it takes the principles of that book and provides it to you at very low cost, and that's available again through booksbyvision.org. And if you're interested in learning more about vision and about myself and what we do, you can see that on drstandekoven.org or vision.edu. Well, let me just jump into some more thoughts on really grief and the process of experience the relief that God would have for those of us that have experienced loss and are going through the process of mourning. But first of all, let me look at some of there's some symptoms, if you will, or indications that someone is not really processing through their grief well. And one of the things that we call it's delayed bereavement. It really can lead to all kinds of additional problems in a person's life. So it's really important. Again, I know a lot of people have preached, oh, you're a Christian, you should never grieve. No, we grieve, but not as those without hope. We grieve as those with hope, but we still must grieve. It's essential for our mental, emotional, and even physical, let alone spiritual health. So folks that really don't grieve, they may have had a loss or they've not really dealt with issues in their life. They can experience things like depression, anxiety, even kind of symptoms of what's called PTSD with flashbacks. That can grief and the feelings of loss and being very sad and depressed can come in times and seasons. People can become stuck and have distorted ways of thinking about themselves, about the world. Like their life stopped, their life ended when they had a certain loss. Life doesn't stop, life doesn't end, but sometimes it feels like it. And thus it leads to many times avoidant behavior, especially avoiding talking about the loss that one has experienced. But really, talking about it is essential. So, in the general process of dealing with grief, there's really three words that I like to use, and it's admit, submit, and commit. In Proverbs 28:13 and Psalm 19:12, Psalm 90 verse 8 talks about the importance of admitting one's own faults, one's issues, one's needs. It really is me, Lord, standing in the need of prayer. We all need prayer, we need relationship, and we need to admit if we've had a part in causing the grief that we've experienced. We need to face the truth. So if you're going to get help, you got to be willing to admit that, yes, I have a problem, I need to grieve, I need to mourn, I need to deal with these issues in my life. Second, then, is to submit to a process of change. And really, change can happen in a number of ways. I know people that, they've gone to the front of the church, what we used to call the altar, and people have prayed for them, and they've just prayed on their own. And, God met them, and they've experienced an incredible release of whatever the burden that they've been carrying. And God does that. He continues to do that today. But He doesn't always do that. For many of us, it's not that instantaneous, almost miraculous prayer that makes the difference, but it's a longer-term process. But we have to be willing to submit to the goodness of God. One of the things that we know for certain is sometimes life stinks. It's truth. Then you die, if you're lucky, I guess, some would say, but God is good. He's always good. And his mercies are new every morning, but his grace is sufficient for all things. And so we know those things are true, so we have to be willing to submit. And sometimes part of that submission is the willingness to talk to somebody, and not just one of your peers, but someone that is more mature than you are spiritually, someone with some skills like a therapist or a counselor who can help you to be able to work through the grief and loss that you're experiencing. So you admit, submit, and then you really have to commit to doing some things differently. There's many things that someone can do that's suffering with grief and loss, and one of things is exercise. Light exercise even can make a big difference in a person's life. Eating well, getting enough rest, all of these things are important as a part of a recovery process from a major loss in one's life. But also it's the willingness to commit to maybe, letter writing or whatever, a counselor or someone advises you to do. It's committing yourself to this path that I'm going to get through this by God's grace and by God's help. Now I want to just give you 15 tips then. These are just like some little tips that help people to deal with grief and loss. And I hope these will be helpful for you. Number one is to nurture your relationship with God. We hear it said in the scriptures that God never leaves us nor forsakes us. So when you ask the question, where's God in the middle of my grief, in the middle of my loss? The answer is yes. He's right in the middle of your grief. He's right in the middle of your loss. And so it's important to nurture that relationship to the best of your ability through prayer, through the word, etc. Accept grief. Let's face facts that sometimes facts are not fun. They're painful. That we have to accept the grief and be willing to talk about the loss. Now again, I tell people, you talk about it when you feel like talking about it, and sometimes you just don't feel like talking about it. And if someone is desperate to talk to you about your grief and you don't want to talk about it, hey, you're grieving, don't talk about it. Really, for a long time down the road, if you've had a major loss, you've gone through divorce, you've had a death in the family, you can be angry and sullen and all you have to say is, I'm sorry, I'm grieving. It kind of gives you a special pass. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying it works. But one thing's for sure, you've got to talk about it eventually. And talk to people who will listen more than they want to give you advice. They want to listen. Keep busy if you can, as much as possible. Keep good routines. Take care of yourself. Eat well, exercise, and whatever you do, get rid of guilt. Guilt is a useless emotion when it comes to grief and loss. I hear people, if I would have only, or if I would have said this, or if I hadn't have done that. None of that matters today. None of that matters now. Just lay it all on Jesus. He's got the shoulders to be able to handle any grief, any guilt that you may have. Accept the loss to the best of your ability. Accept it. They're gone. This happened. We've gone through this pandemic. I've lost my job. But it doesn't mean I'm a loser. It just means I've lost. And those that go through losses, you have to be able to accept it. One of the things that helps a lot of people is to join a group. And there are some excellent grief recovery type of groups available, but a home fellowship can be hugely beneficial. And if you're not a part of a church, and especially once the doors really start to open again and you can gather. Gathering is so important. Hey, look, thank God for technology like this. You can get some teaching instruction, but it's not the same as true koinonia, as true fellowship. We need to gather. So try and join a group. Associate with friends. Hey, whatever you do, postpone major decisions until you've worked through the vast majority of your grief. People that lose a spouse and then get married very quickly normally end up losing that spouse as well. Not necessarily to death, but to divorce, because they make poor decisions when you make a decision to sell a house, buy a house, move or whatever, in the midst of your grief and loss, it rarely turns out well. It's always wise to postpone decisions. I've found for a lot of people, if you journal, if you write things out, you know, you don't have to be poetic. It's just writing what you feel. Remember, it's just between you and the journal and God. You know, if you have someone that you really trust, you can share some of your thoughts with. But journaling externalizes some of the hurt, some of the pain. And when you then read it through later, and sometimes you look at that and say, well, I don't even know if that makes any sense, or that seems ridiculous, or that makes me laugh. But you begin to get some perspective on yourself and on the loss when you journal. Now, take care of others. Now, this may sound counterintuitive, but really, if you'll take care of others, you'll be less focused on yourself. Because what often happens in grief and loss is we tend to become very introspective, and sometimes we become very self-absorbed. And so if you're taking care of others, not exclusively and not only so that you're neglecting taking care of yourself, but in a healthy balance, it can really make a difference. And hey, if nothing else is working and you're really stuck in a grief cycle, get some help. You know, the first place to call is usually your pastor. Call your pastor, let them know what's going on. They know that you've had a loss. They know what you've gone through. If they don't either feel they have time or expertise to help, normally they have some excellent referral sources that will help you deal with your loss. You know, grief is something that we're all experiencing now. And the answer to that is to mourn. It's to let the emotions go. It's to talk about it. It's, you know, not on Facebook, not on Twitter, not on TikTok or Instagram, but face-to-face with real live people is usually the best way to process things through. And so listen, if you're dealing with grief and loss today, I just want to encourage you, hey, if nothing else, get the resources we've already mentioned. Grief Relief or Mourning to Dancing. They're available through booksbyvision.org. And hey, next week we're going to talk more about the grief and loss process and get a little more in depth about how to deal with grief and loss in your life. And so until next Wednesday, hey, God bless.